Good morning. Page 395. Now at last the Estonian women wept. But there were also, of course, the consummate activities. They took the arrival of this fascist rabble very much to heart. They should drown the lot of you, such people shouted, and greatly resented their reluctance to work in grates for the country which had liberated them from bourgeois slavery. These consuls were given the task of supervising the exiles and their work, and they were warned at the first shot they should organize a roundup at Achinsk station, where there was an amusing mix-up. There was the laboriously district bosses bought from the convoy 10 wagon loads of exiles, 500 people or so, for their collective farms on the river Chulam, and briskly shifted them 150 meters to the north. They had, in fact, been assigned to the Sarolinsk mining administration in Khakassia, but of course did not know it. The mine managers were awaiting their contingent, but the contingent had been sprinkled about collective farms in which the year before peasants had received 200 grams of grain for workday. By that spring, there was neither grain nor potatoes. The villages were loud with their bellowing of hungry cattle, and the cows flung themselves like mad things at half-rotted straw. So it was not out of malice, or to keep the exiles on a tight rein, that the collective farms gave these newcomers 1 kilogram of flour per person per week. Oh, that image of the cows. So much suffering. That was a very respectable advance, almost equivalent to their total future earnings. For the Estonians, it was an appalling change from their homeland. There were, in fact, big barns full of grain in a settlement nearby called Pullavoy. Stocks had mounted up from year to year because nobody had made arrangements to remove them, but this was now state grain, and the kolkhoz had no claim to it. The people all around were dying, but no grain from those barns was given to them. It belonged to the state. On one occasion, kolkhoz chairman Pashkov took matters into his own hands and issued 5 kilograms to each kolkhoznik still living, and was sentenced to the camps as a result. The grain belonged to the state. The kolkhoz's troubles were its own affair, and this is not the book in which to discuss them. There, on the Chulam, the Estonians lived a life of desperation, trying to master an astounding new law, steal or die. They had begun to think that they were there forever, when suddenly they were all plucked out and driven off to the Sarolinsk district of Khakassia. The owners had found their missing contingent. There were no actual Khakasians to be seen there. Every settlement was a place of exile, and in every settlement there was an MVD post. There were gold mines, new shafts being sunk, silicosis everywhere. Indeed, these broad expanses were not so much part of Khakassia or Krasnoyarsk region as the territory of Kaksalado. The Khakasian Gold Mining Trust, or Yenisei the Yenisei Development Authority. They belonged not to the district soviets and district party committees, but to the generals of MBD troops and the secretaries of district party committees, truckled to the local MVD commanders. But those who were simply sent to the mines did not have the worst of it. Much worse off were those who were enrolled in prospecting artels. Prospectors. It has a romantic ring. My dad was a prospector. One of the last single. Very proud of him. The word glistens as though lightly dusted with gold, but any idea you like to think that can be given an ugly twist in our country, you like to think of, can be given an ugly twist in our country. Special settlers were forced into the artels because they dared not object. They were sent to work mines, which the state had abandoned, and as unprofitable. There were no longer any safety measures in these mines, and water ran in continually as though it were raining heavily. The yield was low, however hard you worked, and it was impossible to earn a decent wage. These dying people were simply sent to lick out the residual traces of gold, which the state was too miserly to abandon. The teams came under the prospecting sector of the mining administration, which thought of nothing, recognized no obligation, except to hand down the plan and exact fulfillment. The artels were free, not from the state, but only from the benefits of its legislation. They were not entitled to paid leave, nor, as a matter of course, to Sundays off, as even sects in the camps were, since any month might be declared a Stacano month, which with never a Sunday in it. The state's rights were preserved. A man who did not turn up for work was put on trial. Once every 2 months, a people's judge arrived and condemned several exiles to 25% compulsory labor. There were always plenty of excuses. These prospectors earned 3 to 4 gold rubles, 150 to 200 Stalin rubles per month. At certain times, near Kopyov, the exiles were paid not in money but in vouchers. What need had they, in fact, of ordinary Soviet currency, which they could not move around anyways? And the shop at the mine would accept payment in coupons as well. Elsewhere in this book, we have developed in detail the comparison between prisoners in the camps and peasants in the days of serfdom. But if we remember our Russian history, we know that the hardest conditions were those not of the peasants, but of the workers tied to factories. These vouchers, expendable only in the mine shops, bring memories of the gold mines and factories of the Altai flooding into our minds. The miners assigned to these enterprises in the 18th and 19th centuries deliberately committed crimes in order to get into Katorga and to have an easier life of it. Even at the end of the last century, workers in the Altai gold fields had no right to refuse work even on Sunday. They paid fines. CF, the compulsory labor system. And there were shops with poor quality provisions, cheap drink, a short measure. These shops, and not the incompetently conducted mining operations, were the main source of income for the gold mine owners, or in modern terms, the trust. Strange that everything on the archipelago should be so unoriginal. In 1952, K.S., a frail little woman, did not go to work in a hard frost because she had no felt boots. For this, the head of the woodworking artel sent her logging for 3 months, still without felt boots. These months before childbirth 3 months before childbirth, she asked to be given some lighter work than moving heavy logs. And the answer was, if you don't want the job, give it up. Then a benighted woman doctor got the date of her confinement wrong by a month and did not send her on leave until 2 or 3 days before she had her child. Argument will get you nowhere out in the MVD's taiga. But even there, life was not wrecked beyond despair. Total ruin was an experience reserved for those special settlers who were sent to collective farms. There are people nowadays who debate, and it is not a foolish argument, whether life was really any easier in the kolkhas than in the camps. But what we may answer, if the kolkhas and the camp are combined, well, that was the position of the special settler in the kolkhas. It was a kolkhas to the extent that there were no regular rations. Only at sowing time did they issue 700 grams of grain a day, and then it was half rotten, mixed with sand, earth-colored, no doubt swept up from the floor of the barns. It was like a prison camp, and the settlers could be put in detention cells. If a foreman complained about one of the exiles in his game, the kolkhas management would telephone the MVD post, and the MVD would take the man inside. There was no way for picking up extra earnings. You couldn't possibly make ends meet. For her first year of work in the kolkhas, Maria Zumberg got 20 grams of grain per workday. A little bird can find more hopping along the roadside. And 15 Stalin kopecks, 1.5 Khrushchev kopecks. With her earnings for a whole year, she bought herself an aluminum bowl. What, you may ask, did they live on? Why, on parcels from the Baltic states. Their people had been banished, but not the whole people. But who was there to send the Kalmyks parcels or the Crimean Tatars? Walk among their graves and ask them. Whether this too was part of the decision made by their own Baltic governments, or an example of Siberian correctness, special instructions concerning the Baltic states were observed until 1953, until the father of the peoples was no more. No more work for them except the heaviest, only the pick, the shovel, and the saw. You are here to become real human beings. If management promoted someone, the MVD post would intervene and remove him for general duties. Then they would not allow even special settlers to dig in the gardens at the mining administration's rest home for fear of offending the Stakhanovites who were recuperating there. The MVD, the MVD post commander even had M. Zumberg dismissed from the post of calf herd. You haven't been sent here for your summer holidays. Go and stack hay. The chairman had the greatest difficulty in keeping her. She had saved his calves from brucellosis. She had become very fond of Siberian cattle, which she found better natured than Estonian beasts, and cows who were unused to kindness licked her hands. Grain suddenly had to be loaded onto barges in a hurry, and special settlers worked without pay or reward for 36 hours on end, chulum. In that whole period, there were 2 breaks of 20 minutes each for food and 1 rest period of 3 hours. Either you do it or we'll send you farther north. If an old man fell down under the weight of a sack, the consumal overseers kicked him up again. Settlers had to report weekly. The MVD post is several kilometers away, you say, and the old woman is 80. Get a horse and carrier in. Every time they reported, they were reminded that attempted escape meant 20 years hard labor. The security officer's room is next door. Exiles are called in there too. The bait of a better job is dangled, and they threaten to deport an only daughter beyond the Arctic Circle, separating her from her family. Is there anything they cannot do? At what forbidden limit was their hand ever stayed by conscience? They gave the exiles tasks to perform, kept an eye on such and such, gather the evidence which will imprison so-and-so. If the merest sergeant from the command post entered a hut, all the exiles, even the aged women, had to rise and remain standing unless permission to sit was given. I hope that the reader has not misunderstood me to mean that exiles were deprived of their civil rights. Oh, no. Their civil rights were preserved intact. Their passports had not been taken from them. They were not deprived of the right to participate in elections on a universal, equal, secret, and direct ballot. That supreme, that glorious moment when you strike out all the candidates on the list except the one of your choice was jealously preserved for them. Nor were they forbidden to subscribe to the state loan. Excuse me. Remember what torments the communist Dyakovs suffered in the camp when free kolkhozniki, cursing and grumbling, grudgingly gave 50 rubles, 400 each, were wrung out of the Estonians. You're all rich. If anybody doesn't sign, we won't let him have his parcels, and we'll move him farther north. They would do it too. What was to stop them? The tedium of it all. Nothing but the same thing over and over again. At the beginning of this part 6, we appeared to be discussing something new, not the camps, but the exile system. And this chapter made fresh start. Our themes was no longer the administrative exiles, but the special settlers. Yet, we are back where we started. Must we, and if so, how often must we repeat ourselves again and again and again? Tell the story of another, a different exile colonies in other places, at other periods, people by other exiled nations, and if so, which? Groups of exiles belonging to different nationalities, interspersed and clearly visible to each other, displayed their own national characteristics, their own way of life, their own special tastes and inclinations. Far and away from the most industrious were the Germans. They had hacked themselves free of their past lives more resolutely than any of the others. And what sort of homeland had they had on the Volga or the Manich? As once they had rooted themselves in Catherine's fecund allotments, so now they had put down roots in the harsh and barren soil Stalin had given, abandoned themselves to this new land of exile as their final home. They began settling in, not temporarily until the next amnesty, the first act of clemency by the Tsar, but forever. They had been exiled in 1941 with not a stick or a stitch. They were good husbandmen and indefatigable. They did not fall into despondency, and even in this place set to work as methodically and sensibly as ever. Is there any wildness on earth which Germans could not turn into a land of plenty? Not for nothing did Russians say in the old days that a German is like a willow tree. Stick it anywhere and it will take. In the mines, in the machine and tractor stations, in state farms, wherever it may be, the bosses could not find words enough to praise the Germans. They had never written better workers. They had never had better workers. By the 50s, the Germans, in comparison with other exiles, and even with the locals, had the stoutest, roomiest, and neatest houses, the biggest peaks, the best milch cows. Their daughters grew up to be much sought-after brides, not only because their parents were well off, but in the depraved world around the camps, because of their purity and strict morals. The Greeks, too, ardently embraced their work. Although they never stopped dreaming about the Kuban, they grudged no effort in this new place either. Compared with the Germans, they lived in rather cramped quarters. But they soon caught up with them in the number of their cows and the richness of their gardens. In the little marketplaces of Kazakhstan, it was the Greeks who had the best cream cheese, the best butter, the best vegetables. The Koreans prospered even more in Kazakhstan, but of course they had been exiled earlier, and by the 50s were already in large measure emancipated from serfdom. They were no longer required to report, and they traveled freely from oblast to oblast, provided they did not cross the borders of the Republic. They did not excel as good home builders or husbandmen. Their homes and steading were uncomfortable and primitive until the younger people became Europeanized, but they responded very well to education, quickly filled the educational institutions of Kazakhstan. No one put obstacles in their way during the war, and became the main component of the educated stratum in the Republic. Other nations, secretly cherishing dreams of return, were incapable of such single-mindedness, of living wholly in the present, but as a rule they submitted to discipline and gave the MVD little trouble. The Kalmyks could not stand up to it and grieved themselves to death. Here, however, I cannot speak from observation, but there was one nation which would not give in, would not acquire the mental habits of submission, and not just individual rebels among them, but the whole nation to a man. These were the Chechens. And you might remember the very, very recent, maybe in the 90s, the Chechen War. Now we can see where this animosity stems from. I recall hearing it as a child. Many of you might be younger, but I recall my mother and father talking about it. We have already seen how they behaved toward runaways from camps, and how they alone, among the exiles of Deshkazgan, tried to support the Kengyar rising. I would say that of all the special settlers, the Chechens alone showed themselves sex in spirit. They had been treacherously snatched from their home, and from that day they believed in nothing. They built themselves exactly low, dark, miserable huts that looked as if you could kick them over. Their husbandry in exile was all of this sort, all just for a day, a month, a year, with nothing put by, no reserves, no thought for the future. They ate and drank, and the young people even dressed up. The years went by, and they owned just as little as they had to begin with. The Chechens never sought to please, to ingratiate themselves with the bosses. Their attitude was always haughty, and indeed openly hostile. They treated the laws on universal education and the state curriculum with contempt, and to save them from corruption would not send their little girls to school, nor indeed all of their boys. They would not allow their women to work in the kolkhoz, nor did they believe in slaving in the kolkhoz field themselves. They tried whenever possible to find themselves jobs as drivers. Looking after an engine was not degrading. Their passion for rough riding found an outlet in the constant movement of a motor vehicle, and their passion for thieving in the opportunities drivers enjoy. This last passion, however, they also gratified directly. "We've been robbed, we've been cleaned out," were concepts which they introduced to peaceful, honest, sleepy Kazakhstan. They were capable of rustling cattle, robbing a house, or sometimes simply taking what they wanted by force. As far as they were concerned, the local inhabitants and those exiles who submitted so readily belonged more or less to the same grade as the bosses. They respected only rebels. And here is an extraordinary thing. Everyone was afraid of them. No one could stop them from living as they did. The regime, which had ruled the land for 30 years, could not force them to respect its laws. How did this come about? Here is an episode in which the explanation is perhaps epitomized. One of the pupils in the Ch04 school, when I was teaching there, was a young Chechen, Abdul Kudayev. He inspired no warm feelings and did not try to do so. He seemed to be afraid of demeaning himself by making himself pleasant. He was always ostentatiously cold. He was very arrogant. He could be cruel, but you could not help admiring his clear, precise mind. In mathematics and physics, he never remained on the surface with his schoolmates, but always went deeper, asked questions, tirelessly searched for the heart of the matter. Like all the children of settlers, he was inevitably drawn into the so-called social activities of the school. First, the Young Pioneers Organization, then the Komsomol, then the school committees, wall newspapers, character training courses, political discussion groups, the spiritual price for education, which the Chechens paid so unwillingly. Abdul lived with his old mother. None of their close relations had survived but Abdul's older brother, who had long ago taken to crime and served more than one spell in the camps for theft and murder, but had always emerged before his time either under an amnesty or because he got remission for good conduct. One day he appeared in Ch04, drank for 2 days without pausing for a breath, quarreled with a local Chechen, seized a knife, and brushed him. An old Chechen woman who had nothing to do with either of them barred his way, flinging her arms wide to stop him. If they had obeyed Chechen law, he would have thrown down his knife and given up the chase, but he was by now a thief first and a Chechen second. He brought down his knife and fatally stabbed the innocent old woman. The thought of what awaited him according to the law of the Chechens now entered his drunken head. He rushed to the MVD to make a clean breast of the murder, and they gladly put him in jail. He had found a hiding place, but that left his younger brother Abdul, his mother, and also an old Chechen of their clan, Abdul's uncle. News of the murder went around the Chechen community of Ch04 in a flash, and all 3 surviving members of the Kudayev clan gathered in their house, laid in stocks of food and water, blocked the window, nailed up the door, and lay low in this fortress. The Chechens of the murdered woman's clan now had to take vengeance on some member of the Kudayev clan. Until Kudayev's blood was spilled in payment for their blood, they would be unworthy to be called human beings. Excuse me. Sorry. So the siege of the Kudayev's house began. Abdul did not go to school. All Ch04 and the whole school knew why. A member of one of the top classes in our school, a Komsomol, an outstanding pupil, was threatened with murder by the knife at any moment. Perhaps this very minute, as the bell rings and the others take their places at their desks. Perhaps now, while the literature teacher is talking about socialist humanism. Everybody knew. No one forgot it for a moment. Between classes, they talked about nothing else and could not bring themselves to look at each other. Neither the party organization in school, nor the constable, nor the director of studies, nor the headmaster. Nor the district education department. Nobody went to try to save Kudyev. No one even approached his besieged home in Chechen territory, which was buzzing like a hornet's nest, and it wasn't only they. At the first breath of bloody vengeance, the district party committee, the executive committee of the district Soviet, the MVD post, and the militia behind their adobe walls, all of them so awesome to us until now, all froze in craven inactivity. A savage and ancient law had breathed on them, and all at once there was no Soviet power in Kokterek. Nor was its heavy hand quick to reach out from the provincial capital to Jambul. For 3 days went by, and no plane flew in with troops. No firm instructions arrived, except an order to defend the jail with all the forces to hand. This helped the Chechens and us too to see clearly the difference between real power on this earth and the mirage of power. The Chechen elders were the only ones to show sense. They went first to the MVD and asked them to hand over the elderly Kudyev for summary punishment. The MVD nervously refused. They came back to the MVD a second time, asking them to have Kudyev tried in public and to shoot him. While they watched, if this was done, they promised that the vendetta against the Kudyevs would be at an end. No more reasonable compromises could have been devised. But think of the difficulties. A trial in open court, an execution promised in advance and carried out in public. Kudyev, after all, was not a political, he was a thief, a class ally. The rights of 58 could be trampled underfoot, but not those of a multi-murderer. The MVD referred it to the oblast, and the request was turned down. In that case, the old man informed them, the younger Kudyev will be killed within the hour. The bureaucrats of the MVD shrugged their shoulders. It was none of their business. They were not there to think about crimes as yet uncommitted. But some faint awareness of the 20th century touched not the MVD, oh no, but those hardened old Chechen hearts. In spite of everything, they forbade the avengers to exact vengeance. They sent a telegram to Alma-Ata. Some other old men, those most respected by the whole people, hurried down. They convened a council of elders, which anathematized the older Kudyev and sentenced him to death, where and whenever he came within reach of a Chechen knife. The other Kudyevs they summoned and told, go in peace, no one will touch you. So Abdul took his books and went to school. There he was met with hypocritical smiles by the party organizer and the Komsomol organizer. From the moment of his return, he heard the communist social conscience extolled in lessons and political instruction periods, with never a mention of the vexatious incident. Not a muscle twitched in Abdul's somber face. He had learned all over again that the greatest force on earth is the law of vendetta. We Europeans, at home and at school, read and pronounce only words of lofty disdain for this savage law, this cruel and senseless butchery. But the butchery is perhaps not so senseless after all. It does not sap the mountain people, but strengthens them. Not so very many fall victim to the law of vendetta, but what power the dread of it has over all around. With this law in mind, no Highlander will casually insult another and we insult each other in drink from lack of self-control or just for the hell of it, still less will any non-Chechen look for trouble with a Chechen, call him a thief or a ruffian, or accuse him of jumping the queue, for the answer may be given not in words, not in abuse, but with a knife in the ribs. And even if you grab a knife yourself, you won't have one on you. You're civilized. You cannot give blow for blow on your whole family, or your whole family will fall under the knife. The Chechens will walk the Kazakh land with insolence in their eyes, shouldering people aside, and the masters of the land and non-masters alike respectfully make way for them. The law of vendetta creates a force field of fear, and so gives strength to its small mountain people. Strike your neighbors, the strangers may fear you. The ancestors of the Highlanders in remote antiquity could have found no stronger hoop to gird their people. Had the socialist state offered them anything better? Thank you for listening. Have a great day.